So hi, everyone. My name's Kristen Fletcher. I'm the Programs and Community Engagement Coordinator here at the Haley Public Library. Tonight is the last of a two-part series with Amy Mattias looking at permaculture, its history, ecological design principles, ethics, and zone techniques. I always like to feature a book that we have here at the library. Unfortunately, it's been checked out, so I am showing you a very thin version of it right here. This is a book that Amy recommended going into part one of the permaculture talk, The Edible Ecosystem Solution, Growing Biodiversity in Your Backyard and Beyond. And it's been checked out much of the time since we've had it. Thank you, Amy, for the recommendation. We have other permaculture books and sustainable gardening books that I hope you'll stop by and check out. So without further ado, let me introduce Amy Mattias to you. She recently received her permaculture design certification through the Earth Activist Training, which is a Permaculture Institute of North America certified program. Over many years of gardening, Amy has incorporated permaculture principles into her personal garden and now her new home, as well as her life as a whole. In addition to her passion for gardening, Amy is a food systems reformist, spending her career building a stronger and resilient regionalized food system in southern Idaho. She is the program director for the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience, and within this role, she helped launch the 5B Resilient Garden Initiative in the spring of 2020. She co-manages the Wood River Seed Library and also serves as a volunteer board member for the Idaho Center for Sustainable Agriculture and Fair Idaho, which advocates for Idaho's independent restaurants, family farms, retailers, and food and beverage producers. So thank you for joining us tonight, Amy. This is a wonderful topic. I've had several people say to me after the first one, I have never heard of permaculture. So these talks are helping to spread the word. And after this talk is over, I'll do some light editing and post it on our website. You can just go to the website, look for programs, look for program archives, and you can watch it there. Plus, I will send out a link to the video after this talk as well. So in a couple of days. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Kristen, for that. I will get my screen share going, and thank you. I see some familiar names on the screen, so glad to have you here today. I really am happy that Kristen was able and I were able to schedule a second recording of this because I think this kind of information, there's a lot that I'm going to share with you today. That's always good, even if you're here in person, to be able to go back and look through it. Let me stop that and restart because that did not pick up for whatever reason.
And of course, we tested it just before we went live. There we go. I can see it.
Uh-oh.
Amy, can you hear me? Amy?
I think I lost audio again, Kristen.
No, I can hear you now. You
Okay.
did for a little while, but you're good and your image is on. So it's on full screen. So we are good to go.
Okay, we'll cross our fingers that we don't have that happen again.
Technology.
Right. Yeah, it's a little trying this evening, but hopefully it stays good for the next hour and a half-ish or so. Okay, so as Kristen mentioned, Amy Mattias here, Program Director for the Sun Valley Institute for Resilience, and I have been gardening for the last 7 years in the Wood River Valley, and I did just finish my permaculture design certificate this past spring. I learned a lot in that program, and I know I have more to learn as I continue down this path and get more design projects under my belt. Also, as Kristen mentioned, this is a two-part permaculture series. In the first part, we focused on a brief history of permaculture. We discussed the 3 permaculture ethics, design principles, and zoning methodology. If you weren't able to attend that one, I do recommend watching the recording, especially if you're new to permaculture or want a refresher on the ethics, the zones, and a deep dive into the principles. Today, in the second part, we're going over the steps to implement a project design, from the site and project intake to creating material lists and drafting the design. I'm using my current project, a home I purchased this past spring located down in Gannett. That'll be our example, and I'll share my process with you all. We'll have time to ask and answer questions during the presentation, and I plan to leave some time at the end to discuss your own project ideas or any other questions you have. So just to give you a quick overview of permaculture, permaculture is a design framework inspired by the observation of natural systems. Each project is unique and based on site specifics, client, designer, or project lead goals, constraints like budgets and timelines, as well as lot lines and naturally occurring barriers like a cliff or the river's edge or a steep slope. Each and every permaculture project takes into account 3 ethics. Those are earth care, people care, and fair share. A zoning framework, which is really based on proximity to a central location and the frequency of use by those who will be working within the designed area, and a set of principles. As I mentioned, you can watch the previous one to get into details and have those explained to you further if you'd like. I just wanted to quickly highlight some of the key principles. Observation of patterns and flows of resources and energy, minimizing waste and striving for a closed system, being thoughtful with material and energy use, valuing diversity, edges, and integrations, self-regulation and responsiveness, and of course, obtaining a yield. So I've broken down the project design process into 5 steps. In the following slides, I have examples that showcase the first 4 steps. And since I've only been working on this project, my new home, for a few months, I don't have anything tangible to show you for steps 5 and 6. So I'm really hoping Kristen will have me back in future years to show how the design takes form and flows through my own experiences. So step 1. You want to know who and what you're designing for. So a site project intake is the first step. What's the size and location of the project? What are the goals? What are the limitations based on timing and cost? What are limitations based on climate, sun exposure, snow load, and existing vegetation? Step 2, observe the site. The longer you can observe, the better. So if this is your home site, spend time daily throughout the year observing the ebbs and flows of existing plants, animals like birds and mammals, bugs, the wind, and the water. Step 3, create material that will inform the design. This can look like plant lists, maps, zoning regulations, rules from your HOA or CC&Rs, a mood board, inspiring photos from your favorite garden spaces, sketches, whatever you'd like to use in your designing process. Step 4, for some, this is the fun part. For others, this is the tedious part. I fall somewhere in the middle. While you may have seen really beautiful landscape design sketches, don't feel like you have to do it perfectly. You can do X's and O's on an aerial Google map. You can write on napkins. This is also the step where you get timeline and budgets dialed in. Step 5, implementation. This is really what we should consider the fun part. This is the step where your design comes to life. Whether you're doing the labor yourself, hosting volunteer groups, or hiring a landscape company, this is the part where roots get in the ground. This includes sourcing your materials, updating your infrastructure like irrigation or building a greenhouse, and actually putting the plants in the ground where you designed them to be. And I think step 6 is probably the most overlooked or underappreciated part. Permaculture, despite having the word permanent associated with it, really isn't permanent. Most designs change over time. You learn as you go. Your needs shift, trees grow, and plants move. Maybe like your significant other, speaking from experience, does not enjoy eating dandelion greens. I don't really think he ever did. So you plant a lot more spinach than you originally planned. The empty lot next door gets built up and you have voles that take over your garden space. Things change and happen over time. So you want to continually assess the design and be willing to go with the flow of your site. So now on to the example. My new home in Gannett. So this is step 1, the basic site intake. Here is an example of the information you all take in. So as you can see, our names are up top. We've had the home for 3 months. Now I guess it's 4 months. So I did this last month, so a little bit longer now. I have 7+ years of gardening. As you can see, primarily edible and medicinal crops, not a lot of ornamentals. Our lot's approximately a ½ acre. Gannett, which is in the Bellevue Triangle area, we are in a frost pocket and we get prevailing winds from the west. Like everyone in the valley, we get little precipitation and it mostly comes in the winter as snow. We'll see how that changes from season to season as the climate shifts. We have some existing hardscapes like 2 patios that you can see here. We have a deck on the west and the north side of the home. There's a concrete slab with the storage unit on it here. And there is a fenced in garden space on the southwest side. We already had irrigation set up, which is primarily sprinkler heads with a rainbird system. While this isn't ideal for me in the long run, it works for now. And despite my desire to change it all, I'll be updating it zone by zone as my budget and timeline allow. On this slide, I fleshed out our goals and associated timeline. So this is another part of step 1 with the client goals and designing on a timeline, because you can't really do everything at once. I guess you could. If you have an unlimited budget and a lot of help doing it, you could do everything you wanted in a summer. I don't really recommend that though, because like I said, you want to assess, you want to see the flows of the site and also really understand if you're making the right decisions in alignment with the goals. So some of the goals that I listed is existing. Well, you can read these goals and I'll kind of talk about this in context. So we already had a garden area here and I wanted to use that immediately for this summer. So I've been planting and harvesting tomatoes, herbs, flowers, leafy greens, a few cucumbers and peppers and some zucchini already. However, that will shift and change in the years to come. We did set up a composting area immediately because I don't like throwing any organic material into the landfill. I imagine this getting a little bit bigger, especially once we incorporate the chicken flock. I wasn't able to do a chicken flock immediately, mostly because I have dogs and I wanted to really understand the flow of the space before getting livestock that I bring in that I'm responsible for. So I'm thinking that'll happen in the spring, but we'll kind of see as my dogs get used to having chicken around, because all of our neighbors have chicken and they're not exactly fans yet. There are lots of trees on the property, but are no fruit trees except for crab apples currently. And since fruit trees take a while to produce, I really want to get those in the ground soon. So adding a fruit tree orchard is top priority for year 1 and 2. This is kind of my design, which I'll get into in more detail for the fruit tree orchard that I'd like to put into place. I also want to grow lots of plants from seeds and cuttings. So this is where I've designed for a little nursery or propagation house. I wasn't sure where this would go before spending a few months on the site, and I'm still not 100% sure because I haven't experienced it in the late fall through the winter and early spring yet, but I'm pretty close to saying this is where it's going to go. And that is the southeastern area. It'll go against our house, which is stucco. So it'll get some thermal gain from that. It'll also be on a patio, which will help with some heat, but it'll avoid the late afternoon sun in the summertime to stay a little bit cooler. And these are already gutters on the house. So I'd like to do rainwater catchment there. So ideally we could take advantage of some of the rainwater to help irrigate in the propagation house. I think that I guess I can mention that these are some longer term goals of mine. I mentioned irrigation and water use efficiency upgrades. I'd also love to install a wildflower meadow and a water feature. I'll talk into more detail about the water feature. That'd be kind of an aspen area with some beautiful stones and waterfall and a big pond. I shouldn't say big pond, a small pond, but a good sized pond for us. Um, I think I just want to mention a couple principles really quick. So as I shared in the previous one, um, my big thing is integration of systems. While the existing landscape is beautiful, the garden is really far from the house. It's on the southwestern corner. The chicken coop is in the northwestern corner. And since those are places that I would go daily, I'd like them to be a little bit closer into the house, into my zone 1 area. I also like to have edible and medicinal plants incorporated into the landscape. And while the current site has over 70 different species here, there's few that are both edible and or medicinal. So I'm thinking of ways to add more plants into the existing landscape and slowly eliminate plants that serve little to no function other than ornamentals. In this process of determining what stays and what goes, I'm observing, as wildlife don't only like native plants, there's a lot of ornamentals that are great pollinator plants, bird habitat. So observation helps me understand those decisions better. So moving on to step 2, which is protracted observation. When we take time to pay attention to our surroundings, we learn a lot of things. What do we pay attention to? It really depends on your site and space, but some important things to include are animals on site, like what birds or mammals do you see? Where do domestic animals like dogs or cats spend time? Do you have any elk, deer, or moose that chomp on your plants? Where are they moving to and from, and is there ways that you can maybe prevent them from getting into your delicate garden edges by having some hedgerows further out? Where does the wind blow? Do you have natural or man-made windbreaks? How does that shift the flow of wind? So when wind hits hard surfaces, it can get jumpy and move across somewhere and then land, versus if you have windrows where things are planted kind of in a pattern where there's space in between, the wind flows through much more gently. So thinking through what's already there, and then if you were to plant a windbreak, how could you plant it to make wind flow nicely and not create any harshness, like hitting a wall, and then the wall directly hits maybe where you like to sit down and have dinner. Where does snow melt or linger? And when it rains, where does it flow towards and where does it all puddle? This can tell you a lot of information, like your soil types, where you have slopes, and also where you have microclimates, like where the snow melts first is a warm pocket, where the snow lingers is a cool pocket. So think about that as you think about planting. Pollution and hazards are also really important to observe. These can be experience-based. Like for me, I realized after living here for a week that the morning commute traffic wakes me up like at 5:30 in the morning. So I'm thinking about how to block some of that noise. Maybe you have a neighbor who's like always barbecuing outside and you really don't like the smell of barbecue. Is there a way to block some of that smell wafting over so you can enjoy your time outside too? And then there's other fire concerns or flooding, like where would those come from if they were coming into your space or on your site specifically? Is there an old building area that maybe there's some toxins or a mining claim up the creek that's washing toxins down onto your property? Another key thing to observe is the movement of all living beings on site. So this is really important to understanding your zoning, which I talked about in the first webinar series, but also like where you place pathways, entrance points like gates, gathering spaces like where you want to put up your patio where people have dinner, or where you'd like to maybe where you can see the sunrise in the summertime, so you want to put a bench facing in that direction. Really observe both people and pets. Where do people go, or how do animals move from point A to point B? So there's a lot you can observe, and I know I didn't cover it all, but if you have any questions or thoughts about observations, you can drop them in the chat. And Kristen, as always, just interject with anything that you think is appropriate. And if there's nothing yet, I will move on to material gathering, which is, I really have fun with the material gathering piece. This is what I've been spending a lot of my time this summer since I moved here, both observation and material gathering. These things can happen at the same time. It's not like step one happens first, step two, and then step three is very rigid. These all kind of go in flow. So as I'm observing, I'm also gathering these materials. So the materials that I put together are both a map. So this is from Google Earth. I took an overhead shot. On Google Earth, you can actually put different shapes and labels on there. So you can see the hard structures here. And then I've put some thoughts of like where I want water catchment, where that future pond may go. The yellow, orange, and red line are actually high and low points. So this is the high marking and this is the low marking, and it's only about 5 feet difference. So it's not that big of a deal, but I was looking into it when thinking about pond placements. And this map over here is my existing plant location map. This is not necessarily annuals or perennial forbs and herby plants, but mostly shrubs and trees. And this matches my plant list as a spreadsheet. So this is kind of where you want to put the information that you think is relevant in your design. So my plant list includes botanical and common names. I like botanical names because that is where you would look up research done on this, because a plant has a botanical name. That same plant might have 10 different common names, and it's not the same from region to region or person to person. So I like to do my research based on the botanical name. But when talking to people, mostly because I'm not that great at pronouncing Latin, I use the common name, right? I also have plant type. So this is both like, is it a vine? Is it a shrub? Is it a tree? But also, is it a P for perennial? Dec is deciduous. And then you can barely see it, but it's evergreen over here, because that gives me some ideas of shade in the summertime versus open space in the winter time. Or do I have some trellising needs? Or is there some fire danger with vines in certain areas? I also put functions here. So this, because this is my observation time period, I am adding to my, oh no, sorry. I went a little bit ahead of myself there. Okay. I'm adding to my function list as I research the existing plants on my property. So this is by no means fully finished. This is both research from observation and also literally searching and reading things about all of these different botanical named plants here. I also, to help me draw my pretty hand-drawn map, put the location and quantity. And then my notes or actions is the section where I'm writing whether I'm doing something this year, like you can see here. Well, I don't know if I have any place on this one that I put the actions that I took, but needs pruning, right? Potential disease signified by leaf curl, potential to remove smaller tree, aggressive climber, these different things that will help me as I further flesh out my design. Other things in the material gathering step that you might want to include are your HOAs or your CC&Rs. Maybe you can't have an 8-foot tall fence. Maybe you're not allowed to have a vegetable garden in your front yard. You want to know this ahead of time, because it's a lot easier to design around rules and regulations than to find out later that you really upset your neighbor by doing something that wasn't allowed, and all your time and energy is wasted because you have to tear it out, or you get into a fight or argument with your HOA. And I don't like conflict like that, so I would rather avoid it up front. Other things that you might want to consider during this section is if you, like, Web Nursery has a binder that they create with all their different plant materials that they sell in it. Or if you order from the, I think it's called the tree sale with the Soil and Water Conservation District hosts every year, you can get plant lists and things like that. So you can see what's available to you and kind of make decisions about what you want. So the next step is where it gets really, really fun, and that's drafting your design. So we are finally to this place, and I am really excited and a little bit overwhelmed that I actually have to take all my ideas and put them into a plan and then execute them. But as you can see, I have already started drafting this. This is the fruit orchard I mentioned in the beginning. So in my southwest corner, I've put out this space to plant some fruit trees and shrubs and vines, like grapes are a vine, as well as some understory plants. So what makes the difference between a food forest and an orchard is the existence of these understory plants. And that also leads to a conversation about guilds, which I can't get really heavily into today, but guilds are essentially a grouping of plants that works together to service each other and fit the ecological needs of each individual plant. So this guild I have drawn here was designed specifically for an apple tree, but I will think about guilds for all the other trees that I have over here. They most likely won't change that much, as fruit trees all kind of need similar things, but maybe there are flavor affinities that I'll swap out. Like the apple tree might get apple mint versus the cherry tree might, what would be a good variety of mint to go with cherry? Maybe a chocolate mint, right? So you might think about different cultivars of an herb to better suit the flavors. Some other things that I just want to point out in my design here is I have fruit trees, which make up the main piece of it too, but it goes all the way down to bulbs. And I included two, oh, that's interesting that I put garlic as an herb, not a bulb. So it's a bulbaceous herb. So I have two types of bulbs here, and you can see that I actually did, sorry, when I drag my mouse, it changes slides. So in my guild, I have two rings around the outside of the tree. The first one is garlic and the second is daffodil. And those are essentially serving as vole deterrents, because I'd rather not fence my tree to keep it more natural. So I'm going to try this natural pest deterrent and hopefully not have any vole or ground squirrel issues. We also have a hawk friend across the street from us. So between the hawk and this, I'm hoping I can get away with not having to fence off my trees. We will see. Other things that I have here just to point out, like comfrey is a biodynamic nutrient accumulator. So its roots pull nutrients from the soil into the leaves, and then you can chop those leaves and mulch around your tree with it, which provides nutrients for it and also helps build soil. I definitely have some dill and yarrow for the insectary benefits of them. I included some red clover to help fix nitrogen. Over here, where this purple trellis grape planting is, this is taking advantage of the existing fence around the garden that is already here. So that'll be where I plant a climbing grape. I think that's all I want to say about this, but
Amy,
yeah.
We do have a question, and I'm not sure you know the flow of your talk better than I, for sure. So I'm not sure if this is the right place to talk about it, but just here's the question. Would you please discuss fencing? Mandatory or not necessary, if one can share some of the plenty? And also you mentioned hedgerows as an alternative to a fence. Do you have any recommendations of what would grow here that could work as a hedgerow?
Yeah, let me go back on a slide to client goals. So I think when you're thinking about whether or not you want a fence or what type of fence or how high of a fence, you have to think about your client goals. If I was working with a client and their goal was to be a production fruit orchard, I would say build a really tall fence, because if your livelihood depends on your production of fruit on trees, you want to keep out anything that's going to eat those trees. I even might say you should net your whole entire thing, because around here, not only do we have lovely elk, deer, and moose that like to nibble on fruit trees, but birds will eat all of your fruit and they will peck off like one little section of every single apple on your tree. So if you are a production, if your main goal is to produce for commercial sale, or even just to produce, like to feed yourself all the food you can, or to feed your family or your neighbors in your community, and that really matters to you, then build a tall fence and put some type of netting over. It's going to be high netting, right? It might not look the most beautiful, but protect what you're investing in, right? If your main goal is to have this beautiful natural space where wildlife can come and go, then it's not as big of a deal. I can't really tell you what you should do until I know what your goals are for the space. So with that said, we definitely have wild ungulates that have, this is their home long before it was ours, and we have to respect that we have taken over their habitat, and they will eat the things that we plant. So how can we think about that? There are the built fences, which work really well if they're high enough. And there's also something about depth there too, because they can jump, right? So you want height and you want some type of depth. So I've heard of some farmers who have put like a second wire of fencing in a little bit. So there's a good couple feet at the very top to prevent deer from jumping over. If you are very interested in creating a habitat that engages with the wildlife and not having like a man-made fence, we can think about, and I haven't seen this in practice around here, I'm sure there are people that have done it, you can create kind of a hedgerow fence idea. And what I like to think about, and we talked about this in the last presentation, I don't know if I have moose who come and visit our yard. We'll see what it's like this winter. There are moose down Pumpkin Center Lane, which is about, I ride my bike down there, and to the end, it's 2 miles from my house. So there's moose within 1.5 miles from my house. Do they come all the way into my yard? I will see this winter. There were no moose tracks or scat that I noticed when we moved in the spring. That was also in May. So it could have been earlier and already gotten worked into the soil. I'm not really sure. Most of the snow was melted when we moved in this spring. But if I have to find a way to deal with the moose, I will most likely not put up a big gigantic fence, but I will think about doing a hedgerow that included on the outside, right? So the closest to the road, thorny, tall plants, woods rose, gooseberries. Those probably would be my two biggest ones on the outside. I might do some brambles on the inside, a little bit in, so I can still access and harvest them. I do like gooseberries, but I tend to not eat as many gooseberries as I eat raspberries, right? Just because raspberries are so delicious. And think about stacking that, and then also think about like, what are the other things that those wild animals like to eat, and can you plant some, I hesitate to use this term, but like sacrifice crops for them. So we talked about moose really liking some of the woody saplings like willow and aspen shoots. So can you allow those to grow on the outside edge of your property to feed the wildlife and keep them out of the inside area? Maybe Fish and Game should not come after me for saying this. Maybe you could even plant some hay or some wheat or some other type of crop that they really like on the outside edge of your property, so that they're staying in that space rather than coming in. And then you could put your really precious plants that you love and you cherish closer in where they are protected. Speaking of the larger animals, I don't know like if there's any kind of deterrence for them. Like, could you put up some shiny flags like people use for birds? Like some people put pie tins in their tree to reflect and scare off birds. Maybe something like that works for moose or deer. I'm not really sure. but you could think about something like that to deter them from getting in closer. I have seen moose and elk not care about dogs at all, but some do. Some are more skittish than others. So if you have dogs in an area and then the dogs don't like to dig up fruit trees, you could plant fruit trees within your dog yard, and that would give them a little bit another layer of protection. You could also put some little fencing to keep your dogs away from the root balls themselves of the fruit trees, if that would be a route that you would want to go in. So I hope that answers the question. Part of me like wants to have a reason to build one of these thorny fence rows to see if it deters, but then I'm like, oh, I really don't want to have to deal with moose in my yard, because my dogs will not be happy about that. I have 3 dogs and we do have a fenced in yard, but they don't like any other dogs coming in our yard, let alone gigantic moose that look kind of like cows and horses. So we'll see.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm pretty close to being done. So we'll have a good amount of time for Q&A, and we can talk more about that too with wildlife fencing if needed, since I know we have a small group on today. Okay, so let's see, back to this one. I think, the other thing that I wanted to mention that's not as easy to see here, I mentioned the trellis grape plantings on this fence. This side right here it's a hedge of lilac shrubs currently, and then there's a road. So those lilac shrubs will ideally buffer some of the noise, some of the pollution and dust from the road, as well as any neighbors potentially spraying from getting into my fruit orchard area. I also plan on putting up signs about being an organic food production space. I'm not certified organic, so I can't mandate that they don't spray, but at least if I have something that brings awareness to it, I hope my neighbors will be conscientious. I also plan on, once I start to produce a lot, creating a little stand right out front that says free food and putting out a lot of free food, because we will have an abundance. And hopefully by sharing with my neighbors are thoughtful about our desire to be as organic as possible. I would like to get bees at some point, but we have a lot of visiting honeybees that I noticed this summer. And until I establish more forage for them, I will not get my own colony of honeybees, just because nectar and pollen are hard to come by, and we have our native pollinators to take care of too, and then our neighborly friendly bees from other people's hives. All right, so I think that covers this. And just going back to what I said earlier, this is something that I will begin. I've started planning, as you can see. I will begin prepping the ground this fall, like this weekend. It's on my to-do list to start by doing what's called lasagna gardening, or sheet mulching, some people call it that. So I will be doing layers of cardboard and newspaper and compost and straw over the areas where I want to plant trees, because this is currently just lawn grass, and I want to build the soil so that I can plant trees into it next spring. And ideally at the same time, I will, as I start to do the sheet mulching, I will make decisions about the irrigation parts that I will need to install in the spring, along with the plants that I plant. When you plant small trees, saplings, shrubs, any of that, they're going to need water, a good amount of water for the first couple years. Ideally, they won't need as much once they're established, but you want to make sure that you have some type of irrigation set up for them in the early season, especially if we have a summer like we did this summer, where it is hot, 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 and windy. You spend a lot of time and money prepping an orchard space, and you want to make sure that you get as much survival as possible. So the irrigation is going to be key for me. So as I start to lay out the sheet mulching, I'll get a better idea of, because this is all sprayer heads right now, I like to convert it to drip irrigation around the fruit trees. So thinking about what type of supplies do I need to do that? What is it going to look like to actually transition over? Or do I keep the existing sprayer heads and add drip irrigation because I don't really want to dig up existing irrigation? So we'll see. We're still going. My husband and I are going back and forth about that because he'll probably be doing the majority of the digging up irrigation labor, and I will be doing a lot of the "that's what I'm telling you to do" thing. Bless him, he's wonderful. Okay, so then the next area. This is my another example of a design draft. This is more of my like, oh, I wish, and this is my plan for the future. I would love a water feature. I just find it to be so relaxing. I love listening to the water trickle down the stream. I really enjoy, we already have a lot of dragonflies on this site, so giving them more of a habitat. We also have a ton of birds, so this would be more bird habitat for them. But however, this is a balance between like what I want because of aesthetics and experience and what's best for our environment. Water features can take a lot of water. Aspen trees use a lot of water. So I'm not 100% there yet. Like if I had $10,000 to spend on landscaping tomorrow and I didn't care about water usage at all, I would do this immediately because I literally love flowing water. I have to figure out whether or not this is something that I want to put the time and energy and money into. Will I feel guilty about it, essentially? So I have dreamed it, and I'm going to just sit with that in the next year or two and see how I feel. So my idea here, this is a berm on the east side of the house is a berm. We have some existing aspen already here. There's a nice low point over here. We already also on site already have columbines. So I would be able to use some of my existing plant material that I could cultivate here. And then I could plant some other things like service berries, some willow. We don't have any willow on the property currently, and I would like willow. It's medicinal, amazing bird habitat. It's an early blooming pollinator food. It's a habitat for swallowtail butterflies, which I love. It can make baskets. I think I already said it's medicinal. Willow's amazing. Would love to have some willow on my property. Horsetail is another one. It's also medicinal. It's great dragonfly and damselfly habitat, which I really enjoy watching. Lupin is a nitrogen fixer, obviously beautiful bloom, pollinator habitat, seeds feed the birds. Yarrow, dynamic accumulator, insectiary plant, and then the oats and vetch are to build soil health and also to provide some more habitat for animals. So if I could, I would, like I said, I would hire labor and make it happen fast and spend a lot of money on materials. More likely, this is going to be something that occurs in 3 to 5 years, and I will do it kind of slowly in our own time and use some of the plant material, and also like in our gardens, in our fenced in garden space. And I talked about this a lot in the first webinar, but in our fenced in garden space, we have raised beds in Oakley stone, and the raised beds are really big. So I can't get, and I'm short, I'm about 5'1", and I can't reach the center of our garden beds without stepping into them. They're just a little too big. So it's also not on drip irrigation, it's overhead watering. So what I would like to do is remove the garden beds, remove the Oakley stone, and keep that space, again, the far southwest side. So it's not ideal for going to every single day, but it would do really well to be a large production space for things like onions and garlic and potatoes and winter squash and corn, things that you don't harvest every day and that you don't need to have constant, care of, to grow in there in rows, and then move like my leafy greens and tomatoes closer to the house area. So if we did that, we would have a lot of leftover Oakley stone to repurpose. And my thought was, well, I could use that Oakley stone to make this beautiful pond watering waterfall area. So you can see this is kind of my sketch of like how I dream this into being, with a little walkway over to the patio here and a little bench to sit and watch. This is also a really nice, I think I shouldn't say it, I don't know this yet because the sun rises over here in the summertime. I think it's going to be a really nice early spring and late fall into winter view of the sunrise, which will be lovely. This is also a fire sector, so I try to throw in some, like, you know, this is why we should do it. Fire sector over here from this, you can't really see, but Gannett Road is essentially over here. So we've seen people drag chains with their RVs. It's horrible. I would get a megaphone and yell at them, or I can just put in a pond. So if the fire comes my way, I have water to extinguish it. Kind of joking with that. Please don't drag chains and create fires. But thinking through that, this would be another rationale for me to actually put in a water feature here, because this would be my biggest fire danger area. It also would give us some nice shade, and because our dog yard is over here as well. So I think that covers what I wanted to talk about in this section. And like I said earlier, I'm really hoping Kristen's going to have me back to talk more about this as my plans come into fruition, because step 5 and 6, implementation, can't really show you anything yet because I'm still working on it. But for people who are ready to implement, just think about your material sourcing. Can you repurpose materials? Can you get materials locally? Because it's really important to support our local nurseries, landscaping companies, hardware stores, etc. You can find great stuff at the building material thrift store, yard sales, estate sales, etc. And step 6, that reassess and redesign. It is so important to continually observe and think about your site and whether or not your goals are being met, or have your goals changed, or did something not work out? Like maybe I dreamed of this amazing garden space and it just like didn't work at all. And I have to be willing to reassess and redesign in order for permaculture to be applied in my life. That is part of permaculture. It is not stagnant. It is moving and flowing, and we work with things. I think that covers it. I will now stop my screen share and we can have a conversation if people want to, or ask more questions, or, you know, whatever anyone wants to do. And I can also reshare my screen if there's slides people want to look at, because I know I talked about a lot. There's a lot of information here. It's permaculture. Landscape design has a lot going on, and then you add a layer of permaculture, and then it just takes it above and beyond. So.
And I'm trying to figure out how to stop the spotlight for you. Oh, maybe I do it over here. Let's see, under more. Oh, it says that you aren't spotlighted. So it must be I'm focused on speaker. There we go. All right. Great. Oh, that was a wonderful talk, Amy. I'm so inspired by your, well, I guess it's the permaculture approach. I took the Sunset Garden magazine approach about 6 years ago, where I did, you know, I looked at where my shade was and where the wind was, where the sun was, and sketched out my place and my use areas. But I can see that permaculture sort of takes that to a whole new level. So I've enjoyed learning very much about this. So I invite folks to unmute themselves. Oops, here we've got another question. How will blueberries work here in zone 3? Some have mentioned in pots for the winter or near a building. Do you have any experience or knowledge about that?
I am less concerned about cold if you get, and this is where I can't remember off the top of my head whether it's high bush or low bush. My assumption would be it's low bush that does well in cold climates, because blueberries will grow in Alaska, they will grow in northern Maine, they can handle the cold. The thing that you want to think about is your soil type. Blueberries like low pH, which is acidic soil. We primarily have alkaline soil here in the Wood River Valley. So one, test your soil. Minot and I have done previous webinars with Haley Public Library on this. So maybe Kristen can share one about soil in our follow-up email to this. You want to know what soil you're starting from. Test your pH. You can do that at home. You can buy a little soil pH test kit. I don't like them as much because for some reason I'm really bad at just seeing the difference in the slight differences in colors, right? It's a color spectrum from, I think, orange or yellow to blue. And for me, like the blues to green all look the same. So I can't really tell the difference between 6.0 and 7.5. Maybe I'm partially colorblind. I don't think so. I don't know what that is. So I would rather get a soil test done from our local extension office. Can give you the materials to dig up your soil and then send it to a lab. The lab they use is in Twin Falls. I think it costs less than $30. It's not a biological soil test, but it will give you pH. So if your pH is above 6, which is still pretty basic, you are not going to have success growing blueberries unless you drastically alter your soil pH. You can do that with different amendments. Organically, you can do that with coffee grounds and pine needles. I think you could add sulfur to it. I'd have to do a little bit of research on exactly what amendments, but there are ways to lower your pH and buffer your pH if you really want to grow blueberries in the Wood River Valley. I am way less concerned about temperature than I am about the pH level. I know I'm saying pH over and over again, but that's what matters. I know this from experience. The first year I got, when my husband and I got married, one of our family members got us an amazing gift certificate to Webb Nursery and like $250 to spend. And I just, coming from Michigan, I wanted blueberries. So I bought 3 blueberries and I didn't even think, and I was like, well, I know they need, coffee grounds or something. And I planted 3 of them. I got, I don't know, maybe 2 handfuls of blueberries in the 6 years that I was growing them. And they were a nightmare. I was constantly worrying about them. They did not produce well. They got diseases. It was very upsetting because I spent a lot of time and energy, luckily somebody else's money, because they're, if you buy a shrub, they're $50 easily. I did not test my soil. I just thought I could add coffee grounds and pine needles and it would be okay. They did not survive. It was very depressing. I will never do it again. And sometimes we have to have those experiences to learn. But if I can share my experiences with you to have you all avoid that, I will do so. That's one of the reasons I like doing these webinars, because we get to share our experiences and learn from each other. Test your soil first and then make a decision about blueberries. You really want to grow blueberries and you don't have acidic soil, you can grow them in pots with acidic soil. That's fine. You can dedicate a whole area of your garden space to having really acidic soil. Maybe you think about planting them with some evergreen shrubs and some other things that like a really acidic soil. There's not a ton that likes acidic soil. What I would probably recommend overdoing that is introduce your palate to other berries that grow easily around here, like currants and gooseberries. They are delicious too. They're not blueberries. They're still really good and they will not, currants and gooseberries are drought tolerant. Our insects around here and our birds they grew up together. They're used to each other. I'm sorry, I just dropped my headphone. Getting too excited talking about blueberries. My headphones fell out. the gooseberries and currants are native. So they're used to our soil, they're used to our climate. The wildlife are used to them. We don't eat them. We don't see them in grocery stores that often. They are delicious. I would suggest replacing your desire to grow blueberries with your desire to grow currants and gooseberries. That was my soapbox about blueberry growing. Oh, and that was Wendy. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for this. This is fantastic. If nobody else has a question, I have another one about when you're buying your plant material. I mean, you showed a picture of one apple tree, or you talked about a cherry tree. Will you get your advice on whether a plant needs a male and female to fruit or self-fruiting? Like, how do you avoid ending up with just a tree or two that don't produce fruit because they're not in the right combination?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that going back to why I mentioned botanical names, one of the reasons that I like to think about botanical names over common names is because that's how you get the information of whether or not they're self-pollinating, cross-pollinating, do they need a helper? So when you're shopping for whether it's at a local nursery or online, like you're doing an order from a nursery that you've heard of, they will, if you know the botanical name, including the cultivar, right? Because like all apples have the same botanical name, pretty much. They have a different cultivar. Different cultivars require different pollination levels. One thing that I'm like 99% think is true is that crab apples serve as a pollinator for apples. Is that right, Kristen? Do you know?
I don't know for sure. I guess the one thing I would say is that different apples bloom at different times, just like pears and stuff. And so, so it could be that crab apples will help pollinate your apples, but on the other hand, they'll need to bloom at the same time. So that would be one thing I'd check into.
Yeah. So you'll see that as early blooming, mid-season blooming, or late blooming. It could also be short blooming or long blooming. So early blooming, I would actually, especially Wendy, you said you're zone 3, I'd probably avoid early blooming because you're more likely to get a frost that would kill off your bloom. So what I would look for apples, if I were you and choosing the cultivar of apple, would be a late blooming and then early maturing or early ripening, right? Because you have a short growing season. So you want something that blooms later but matures faster, versus there's some cultivars that like don't mature and aren't ready to harvest until November. That won't work for you because they will already all freeze. So you want to find something that has a really short season of production so you can go from bloom to ready to pick and eat as quickly as possible. And you can think about that for any plant that you're growing out there. And I also think finding sources that are growing in similar climates. Like I'd probably never order an apple tree from a nursery in Florida. Definitely would order something from a nursery in Canada. Inland Canada or Western Canada, preferably, just because it's more similar to our climate. It's less humid. But I would avoid ordering stuff from a Southern California, but I might consider ordering something. I would absolutely consider ordering something from like an inland Eastern Washington or Oregon nursery, even though it might be a little bit warmer there. It's still going to be drier and more similar to ours. Would absolutely look at ordering from, if you can't get something from Idaho, of course, Montana, Wyoming, Western Missouri. I would probably avoid getting fruit trees from the Northeast just because their climate is so, while it's cold, it's so much more humid than ours, that the relative humidity is going to be really stressful on the plants. Because when you buy fruit trees, most often they're already usually 2 years old rootstock. So they're already acclimated to a certain extent to that humidity of the Midwest or of the Northeast. So bringing them here to Idaho is going to stress them a lot more than if you got them in Utah or Nevada, which might be a little bit warmer, but it's going to be more similar to our humidity. And then they will tell you when you're looking at those nurseries, like, is this self-pollinating? Is it cross-pollinating? Does it need at least two? I think primarily with fruit trees, you want two. Even if they can self-pollinate, like when I was doing the research, like apricots and cherries can self-pollinate, but they do better. I mean, who doesn't do better with a friend or two, right? They do better. That doesn't mean they won't work. Like I had oh gosh, I wish I remembered what variety it was off the top of my head, but some type of dwarf sour cherry tree at my old garden in Haley. As far as I know, there wasn't another one nearby. I got full fruit for 4 years straight. It produced really, really well. You could also, depending on, I think you're out East Fork, so if you have neighbors that also have apple trees or pear trees, the bees will pollinate between them all. You could also look at like things that are wind pollinated because it's windy here. So wind pollination is going to help a little bit versus insect pollinated. If all your neighbors are spraying chemicals and you don't usually have a lot of bees out in early spring, because it's cold and then people are like spraying all the trees in the springtime to prevent whatever bugs they don't like, that would limit your ability to pollinate if it's insect pollinated only.
Yeah, I've never grown apple trees actually, but I'm growing peach and pear. And when I was doing my research for both of those, I reached out to some nurseries, actually one of them in California. I think it was Dave's nursery, but I can't remember for sure, but they're a huge nursery. And I was stumped. I had some questions just like you, Wendy. I just called them up and I said, hey, I'm at zone whatever. This is our precipitation, annual precipitation. We're at this elevation. And they were so helpful. So it never hurts to reach out and just gather information.
Nursery people are plant people and they love talking about plants.
Yes,
and
they
there's
do.
Not enough plant people in this world, especially in the United States. So I'm sure they would be very happy to talk to you. There is also in northern Idaho, the University of Idaho has is it Sandpoint? There's an heritage apple tree operation. They're trying to like save the heritage apple trees. I'm really blanking on the official name. I will get it and send it to Kristen. They host a conference every year. They grow like over 100 varieties of apple trees. And I'm sure there is someone there that would love to talk to you and maybe even sell you or give you some plant material.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the questions.
So anybody else have any questions? Marcia, Randy, Erica? You feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself and we'd love to. Oh, here comes a question.
I'm a gardener wannabe, but I so appreciate it. It was a great presentation and inspiring. I wish I had a nest, but I'm planting seeds for the future.
Glad you're here, Erica. And I will just give a shout out to like community opportunities that are out there. I know the Wood River Land Trust is just beginning their work on a community orchard down in Colorado Gulch. And if you really want to get your hands dirty, they host volunteer days. I'm sure if you wanted something more official, they could set you up with your own thing where you could come and do a little caretaking or just walk the property to see what's going on. I think I don't know how much Wendy wants to share, but I think there may be some upcoming opportunities to help out with planting on their property for some of their plant materials next spring. And if you want to help me, you can come down to Gannett and help
I'll come
me.
visit sometime, yeah.
Mine is not going to be that big, probably less than 7 trees altogether. But, the more hands, the more fun.
Mhm.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, great
Yeah.
presentation. Inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Nice to see you.
Mm.
So let's see, any other questions or comments? It's one nice thing about having a smaller group is it becomes more of a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Wendy, I'll put a shout out too for our local nurseries. Webb, Sun Valley Garden Center, and branching out in Bellevue really have some great trees. And branching out in Bellevue, they're a full-scale nursery, nursery and service, but their specialty is locally adapted fruit trees. So yeah, they've got peaches and apricots and apples and pears and all kinds of good stuff. So
I got my 2 elderberries from there, I think.
mhm.
Elderberries are lovely to grow.
Yep, I got my pear from there.
I do have pots on my porch that I've been growing some herbs and a little lettuce and flowers in. And I'm wondering, like, the talk about blueberry bushes, because I grew up with 30 blueberry bushes in our backyard in New Hampshire. And so it just like hits home. So I'm like, oh, I could test my soil maybe. And I don't know, who knows what I could actually grow in a pot.
Mm-hmm.
Like branch
Yeah.
out a little bit.
You can definitely grow shrubs in a pot. You want to obviously consider water, have some type of, especially in the summer heat, have some type of irrigation where they are watered frequently enough where they're not drying out. If you have like black plastic pots, those will absorb a ton of heat from the sun. So you want to think about protecting them, shading them somehow, or putting them in some type of, even like terracotta, or they have like the plastic ones that are kind of insulated because there's air pockets in there to help buffer some of the heat, because black plastic will fry your roots in the summertime. Learn from experience, of course. Or even just shading if you have like a western facing patio, setting up some type of shade structure so that they're buffered from the hot afternoon sun, but you can grow a ton in pots. The thing about pots is that because they're not in soil, they don't have access, like I mentioned, dynamic accumulators of nutrients before. Soil contains all of the minerals on the entire earth, right? It's rocks broken down is what calcium and magnesium and all that great stuff is. So when you're growing in pots, they're not getting access to that. So they effectively can't help themselves to what they need. So you have to add that in. So you'll have to add in more nutrients. I think vermicomposting is, in my opinion, the best way to do it. You can also do, store-bought stuff that is NPK and all that jazz. I like the organic method. So I would do worm composting, fish emulsion, your own home composting scraps, things like that. I know some people save all their eggshells, crush them up, and put those in their soil for calcium. You will have to add more to them in pots than you would in a backyard garden. That's okay. It's worth it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I notice, I don't know if you subscribe to Gardener's Supply. It's a gardening supply catalog, but they have really committed themselves to sometimes producing, but also providing these large pots. They actually look a lot like a horse tank water trough type of thing, but they can be 4-6 feet long and 2 to 3 feet wide, and they stand up, I'd say probably a couple of feet. So so when you're thinking about pots, when I think of pots, I think of 12 inches across or 2 feet across, but there are some big pots out there that really become permanent parts of your landscape. So that might work well for something like shrubs, or something that has longevity to it, where you're not just planting it for 1 year or 2 years, but where you're making a commitment to it. Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned guilds in my presentation, and you can think about, especially in a larger pot, you can still think about having a guild there, right? So if you you just kind of shrink it down a little bit. So instead of having a 20-foot tall tree, you're having a 5-foot tall shrub. What grows underneath it? So what could you plant in there to bring more of those nutrients to it, or more pollinators to it, or ground cover, so that you're not scorching the soil? And you could do that even in, like, I do that kind of in my house plant pots. A lot of them are weeds, but you know, same purpose, right? I don't like bare soil. So thinking about how are you building a guild in your smaller but big pot or container, because there's a lot of growing space and you can fill it all up.
You know, that made me think about the heat you were talking about with black plastic, and these big pots I'm thinking about are made out of some sort of metal. But if you planted a trailing plant along the edge, it would shade the outside surface of the pot. And so, you know, maybe you plant strawberries there, you know, because they send their runners down, and that might be kind of a fun way to do many things.
Nasturtiums would be another lovely one
that
you could do, and you could put trellises down there too, so they're lifted off the side of the pot a little bit, and you have maybe a little bit more control. Ooh, now I'm getting all excited about doing some pots in my design instead of just focusing on the land and the yard. We have a nice big deck that I could cover in potted garden space. We were actually talking about that. Like, could we, because we have a lot of sun that hits the stucco wall on the west side of our house that's not shaded, and it's like the kitchen dining room area. We don't have AC, and I really don't want to get AC, but it got like it into the high 80s in here for a couple of weeks this summer. And we were like, could we do some trellising, some wood trellising against the stucco, and have planter boxes below it and grow some different viney plants up it? Like, you could do beans, you could do nasturtiums. I don't know if I'd do hops because those are perennial, so I don't know how well they'd overwinter in a pot. Maybe they would do great, right? But thinking of like utilizing the vertical space, but also providing the shade, I think is a really smart way to go about designing an area.
Amy, you talked about in your guilds, I think you had vetch or some other cover crops that were nitrogen fixers and so on. How do you get those into the soil, or you just let the snow do its job and to kill the plant and have it be reabsorbed into the soil? Or do you dig it in? Or what do you do with it? How do you get it?
I will probably, what I will do is I will do a late fall or late summer. It's so hard. Like, what is late fall here? Because I'm not going to do it in November because we'll hopefully have snow. So late summer chopping of it and leaving it on the soil. And the thing about nitrogen, like a lot of these plants that we call nitrogen fixers are incredible plants. Nitrogen it's a relationship they have with some microbes in the soil. I always forget how to pronounce this. Starts with an R. Rhizobium. Yeah, thank you. And if those aren't present, you can't fix nitrogen. So you might plant something, but if the microbe isn't there to get those nodules yellow, you're not actually fixing nitrogen. And the way to deposit the nitrogen, like, okay, I'll back it up a little bit and talk a little bit more about cover cramping and root exudates. So roots are sugar, essentially, right? When you sink carbon, you're taking carbon out of the atmosphere and you're putting it in the roots, and then the roots are alive and they're feeding the plant, and there's this beautiful cycle going on. To actually store the carbon and feed the microbiome, you have to shed the roots. So you have to cut the plant. This is why grazing livestock is so beneficial to building carbon in the soil, because they're munching on the top. Oh, what do I have to display this here? A piece of paper, right? Oh, that's so funny. It says you're about to raise your hand. So let's just pretend. So this is some grass growing and these are the roots. I wish I had, more little tendrils going on. So the cow comes over and munches, 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 and it cuts these back. The roots, because there's like this relationship that the roots only go as deep as the plant goes high, that when you chomp, chomp, chomp and bite the photosynthetic leaves or grasses down, these roots shed. That sheds sugar off into the soil and feeds all the soil life around it. So when you have nitrogen fixed onto those root nodules, it's not actually getting into the soil to be available for other plants until you chomp, 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 or cut, cut, cut to shed those roots. So just leaving the plant to die isn't going to have the same effect as cutting it or grazing it and allowing those roots to shed while the soil microbiome is active, because we get such cold winters that it really goes dormant here in the winter. So the likelihood of it getting available is really going to happen early in the spring when your soil starts waking up. And because you have you're cold pretty far into the spring, you kind of want that action to happen in the fall. So I would chop, 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 not all the way down, leave a little bit on the surface, right? So think of like 1/3 chop, leave 1/3, chop 2/3, and then that's going to shed all those roots into the soil and feed that soil life and prepare and let nitrogen be available for next spring. That's my chop, chop, chop. Hopefully hopefully you got what I was saying on that. I'll work on presenting that a little bit better in the future.
But I do that even with like my chives and stuff like that in pots.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes. Any root shedding is feeding the soil health. This is why I actually never recommend, unless it's a truly invasive noxious weed, I never recommend pulling up plants by the root.
Wow.
Leave the roots in your ground. That is one of the key tenets of regenerative agriculture and soil health, because that is food. Not only is it sugars that feed the microbiome, it also it has like more oxygen down there. So what kills microbes is a lack of sugar, a lack of water, a lack of oxygen, and heat. You get all of those really fast when you pull up the roots and have bare ground. That's like as simple as I can put it, I think. Right. So to break that down a little bit further, roots in the ground is providing the sugars. It's also letting water filter through. It's also because like the soil is not super tight against the root. It looks like that's us. It's really not. So there's oxygen that can get down into the root area, right? So when we leave the roots, they kind of shrivel up in there and they start getting munched on by all these little critters, but all those become oxygen pathways and water pathways in the soil. And it also, there's movement and air going around in there and water going around in there. So the temperature is never going to get as hot. You pull up that plant, pull up those roots, all of a sudden you just have inert soil. It's going to get compacted and it's going to get hot, and water and air aren't going to move through, and all your life is going to die.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
It is really fascinating. I'm really into it. I could talk about soil all day long, and I know I'm just like getting in. I mean, we as a humankind in the Western, research academic paradigm are just starting to understand this stuff. We have so much more to learn. And I think a lot of indigenous people have known this intuitively for many, many, many millennia. We're just starting to actually think about soil as more than just chemistry and physics and just basic biology, right? Like I mentioned earlier, you can do a soil test and it will tell you your pH and it'll tell you your levels of nitrogen. It's not telling you your plant's ability to sequester nitrogen. or shed nitrogen to be available for other plants. We're just getting to the point in our Western understanding of these, this ecology, the soil ecology, to like know it. Like I think about, the human DNA project and how we thought in like, I think it was 2000, I was just a kid. I was fascinated by all this stuff when I was little. Still I'm fascinated by it. But, I thought for sure we were going to know like the DNA sequences that would tell me what diseases I would get later on in life. And like what we realized by doing that level of science was that we're 99% or 90% bacteria, right? So we had this thought that we would prove all of this through DNA, and what we found out, and that was like how little we know. And then, oh, well, if we're 90% bacteria, like we actually have to start studying bacteria, and we know probably 1% of the bacterial life that lives on this earth. We haven't even named it yet because we don't even know how to look for it, let alone understand how it works. So while I say fancy words sometimes like root exudates, like we are just tapping into the bare minimum of the knowledge that's available to us in these systems. And we will just keep learning more and more. And I'm like really excited to be on that roller coaster of learning about it because it's fascinating to me. And nature holds so much wisdom, right?
Well,
and that's part of gardening is I will never be a master gardener because nature is my teacher and nature always has more to share with me.
That may be a good point at which to end this evening. That was, thank you very much for sharing that, Amy. Very inspiring. So thank you everyone for coming tonight. And I'll be sending a link out with this talk and with part 1 and also the soil care talk that Amy mentioned. And I have a little list of things, the heritage apple in Northern Idaho, and that's all I've written down. So Amy, maybe shoot me an email in the morning and remind me what else I need to send out. So.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for being here. It was a
Yeah.
pleasure as always.